Good evening and welcome to Money Matters. My name is Charlie Hunington and I'm Public Relations Chairperson for Life Sciences Pennsylvania. Life Sciences Pennsylvania is the voice of advancement for Pennsylvania's bioscience, medical device, CRO, and healthcare IT industries. Tonight, we continue our special series on science leaders in our local community. I want to remind our viewers that from time to time, financial issues relating to life sciences, healthcare, or technology matters or companies may be discussed on the show. These discussions are not and should be not viewed as financial advice. Moreover, since this program is pre-recorded and shown at a later date, please keep in mind that the information may no longer be current. You should always check with your financial advisor before entering into any financial transaction. I'm pleased once again to have my co-host Kimon Hatza with me. Kimon is a business attorney and partner at GrowthCounsel LLC in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His focus is in the life science, healthcare, and information technology areas. Welcome, Kimon.
Thanks, Charlie. Glad to be here.
Kimon, can you bring our viewers and me up to speed with what's new in your practice since our last show, please?
Sure, Charlie. Thank you for the opportunity. On the life sciences side, it's been very active last couple months. Couple of financings going on for two clients, both in the medical device space. One's a very early stage company. It's looking to do a convertible note offering. The other is a little bit further along. In fact, they've just now gotten their third FDA approval, for the third product that are in use now by physicians. They're in the process of doing a preferred round, which is going to be significant for them. So that's pretty exciting. Also, we're getting a lot more outside general counsel opportunities with companies in the life sciences space. So typically what we do for companies like that on a day-to-day basis is a lot of contractual work. So master services agreements, non-disclosure agreements, any of the type of day-to-day contractual matters that companies need help with. That's the type of stuff we do. And it's predominantly for companies that aren't large enough to have an in-house legal staff yet. And we act as sort of outside general counsel for those companies to handle those sorts of things. So it's been very, very active in the life sciences space.
Kimon, congratulations on the success of your practice. I want to remind our viewers that this is how you can have your questions answered on a future show.
You can have your questions answered on Money Matters. Please go to our website, money-matterstv.com. On our homepage, click on the banner on the right that says, Send us your questions. While you're on our website, you can find information about our host and guests, as well as show notes and links about this show and past shows. Money Matters is also available as a podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, so you can listen to Money Matters while you're on the go. That website address, again, is money, MONEY, -matters, MATTERS, TV.com.
It's with great pleasure that I introduce Joe Truitt. Mr. Truitt is CEO of iECure, a clinical stage biotechnology company focused on delivering cures and transforming the lives of patients with devastating liver disorders utilizing new advancements in genetic medicine. Mr. Truitt was a captain in the Marine Corps and is a member of the board of trustees at LaSalle University, where he graduated with a BS in marketing. He also holds an MBA from St. Joe's in pharmaceutical marketing. Before iECure, Mr. Truitt worked at TAP Pharma, Aura Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, Lev Pharmaceuticals, Achillion Pharma, Biospecific Technologies, and Larimar Therapeutics. Positions in these past companies ranged from sales and marketing to business development to commercial operations and a CEO. In our meeting to organize the show, Mr. Truitt said, I'm on my 5th biotech tour and my 3rd CEO tour. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks for having me.
How did you go from the Marine Corps getting into science?
Yeah, that's an interesting evolution. So at the time, there was a startup division of Abbott Laboratories called TAP Pharmaceuticals. It was a joint venture between Takeda Pharmaceuticals and Abbott. And Takeda wanted to bring their commercial products into the United States. And so rather than setting up their own operation, they partnered with Abbott to build out a commercial infrastructure. And the current president at TAP at that time was a former Army officer, a Vietnam veteran, and he had a great affinity for former military people. So he prioritized the hiring of junior military officers as his sales reps. So we had quite a group that was assembled, and that's how I made it into the pharmaceutical industry. It was simply because Hank Pietrzak, who was the president, wanted JMOs to be his sales reps.
Good for you. Well, tell us about the origin of iECure, please.
Yeah, so iECure is really an interesting story in that it came out of the gene therapy program at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Jim Wilson's lab. This company, actually, the work that we're currently taking into the clinic began almost a decade ago down there at their labs at UPenn. And what had happened is, Jim was working on looking to figure out how to potentially cure urea cycle disorders. And he came across an approach where he was going to do gene editing that we'll go into a little more detail on later, but was able to produce some really interesting data. Jim was connected with many different venture capitalists, but he shared the data with, in particular, a couple gentlemen from Versant and OrbiMed. They saw the data, they got excited, and they decided to form a company. And so that began the process to creating iECure. And then I was brought in as the first chief executive to kind of put the company together.
What did you mean when you told Kimon and me, we are not just a business for the sake of a business?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? We have lots of friends that work in many different fields, but I've always felt that in biotech, we have a real advantage in the way that we kind of set up our companies and the way we create wealth. And that's because we start with the patient and we work backwards. In many of the companies I've worked in, we've had incredible treatments and cures for patients. And so when you have that as your objective, it certainly puts a lot of motivation into the organization and a pep in your step about getting things done. Because at iECure, we're working on a really devastating disease, ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency, for newborns, and unfortunately, these babies are born and they have a really terrible outcome. A lot of mortality, liver transplant, and so the idea of being able to run a business with our objective is curing these people is a pretty terrific situation.
Joe, can you describe the three legs of the stool that must be present for a life science company to take off in a good way?
Yeah, so there's plenty of examples of companies with great science or great investors or even superstar management teams, but you really have to pull the three components together in order to have a real opportunity in biotech. And so the great science, for example, with iECure, right, we had tremendous research that was done down at the gene therapy program. Then that was surrounded by terrific investors, the top of the food chain, venture capitalists at OrbiMed and Versant. And so they put the appropriate amount of capital into the company to start the company. And then I was able to come in to kind of take the science and the capital that was formed and put a world-class team of operators around the table. And so when you have those three components together, it's really amazing what can be achieved.
Last week, iECure announced that the investigational new drug application for iECure 506 had been cleared by the Food and Drug Administration. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, it was a really exciting evolution for the company and for the patient community as well. So the last 8 years of work, we do what's called a pre-IND package. We do all the assessment, we do all the manufacturing, and we put those packages together and submit an application to the FDA. Just to point out, gene editing is in its early phases as an approach for treating diseases. So in the very early stages of gene editing, in the case of iECure and iECure 506, which is our product, we're actually working on newborns or infants. So whenever you're going into that type of a population, there's always a very conservative view from regulators, as you would imagine. They typically like you to start in adults. But because this is a disease of infants, we had to go in and really make our case that there would be a tremendous benefit for these patients, and certainly would outweigh the risk of any new product. So what was really exciting was the fact that we were able to gain that alignment with the regulatory authorities, and that we will now bring this treatment into the clinic and see if the science translates into patients and hopefully delivers a cure for these OTC patients. So it was quite a big deal, Kimon, for us and for the whole gene editing community to actually get this IND done. And so we're really excited about that, but we're already moving on to the celebration's over, and we're on to, getting the clinical trials up and running.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting news, and congratulations and good luck with that going forward. For many of our guests on the show, financing their companies is kind of the bane of their existence. Every time they get one financing transaction closed, they're already on to the next one. How has iECure financed itself to date, and how might this announcement change that?
Yeah, and by the way, I fully agree with what you just said there. Financing of biotech companies is really a critical component of what any executive and executive team have to constantly be focused on, and trying to make sure the companies are well capitalized to get to the important data milestones. And so for us, because I mentioned that Dr. Wilson's science was already well established, and the fact that two blue chip venture firms, OrbiMed and Versant, were willing to put up the initial seed money, we started with a pretty good running start. And then from there, we kind of got our first year under our belt, and we're executing accordingly. And then we went out and did a second round of financing. There was a lot of dislocation in the biotech financial markets over the last couple of years, as I'm sure you guys are aware. And so we typically do a Series A, and then you would go do a Series B. We actually did an A1 because the valuations were under a lot of pressure, and it was really important for us to get the capital into the company. And we also wanted to bring in some new investors. And so we were able to do that successfully by not only getting the original investors, OrbiMed and Versant, to support the Series A1, but then bringing in some new investors, in particular Novo Ventures and Life Capital, to do that next round and kind of put us in a good position to achieve our objectives, which we just did, which was to get these regulatory approvals established and completed. And so now we'll go out and we will look and see if it's a good time to potentially pursue additional financing. But it is something we're always measuring and looking at. And it's really a little bit of an art and a little bit of a science for sure. And something that's really critical, because what you don't want to happen, Kimon, is you don't want to run your company down to fumes and then get to some kind of a meaningful inflection point, and then you really have to kind of sprint to try to raise capital. And investors are very, they do a lot of due diligence, and they really want to take their time and really understand what you have. So raising capital is not really a speed dating exercise. If you want to raise capital 3 months from now, it's probably good to start now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Joe, regarding the greater Philadelphia life science scene, we've debated with various show guests whether we need more VCs and funding sources located here in Philadelphia, or whether money will find the best ideas regardless of where the funding sources are. Where do you stand on this?
Well, I actually believe that the money will follow the projects and the teams. And it probably has to do, one of the advantages we have, Charlie, is we have a tremendous infrastructure of talent. So when you do form a company here, this is my fourth company in the Philadelphia region. It's great because we can easily access talent and assemble the groups that are needed in order to achieve the objectives. And what I have found is that if you have a really good story and really good science and it's compelling, the capital will flow. I mean, we have, if you just look at iECure, none of the six investors are from the Philadelphia area. We have investment from, Life Capital's out of Singapore, Nova Ventures is up in Boston, but their parent is over in Denmark. We Versant's in California, OrbiMed's New York, Qatari Investment Authority is in Qatar, and the Double Point Ventures is down in Florida. So, the capital will find a good project.
How did you find your investors back in 2001, 2002? Must have been difficult during the COVID times for those financing rounds.
Yeah. Well, one of the advantages that we have is the fact that our management team has been well established and well known. So we kind of have all these folks on our Rolodex, and I hope that's not an outdated term, but we know where to find these folks. We know their email addresses and their phone numbers. And because we've done multiple companies successfully, if we reach out and we say we have a new opportunity and we kind of explain, we usually can get a phone call. It is a little more challenging for if you were a first-time team or new, but you usually can rely on your venture partners if you have a first venture capitalist or a second one into the company. And if not, then you can always reach out to the network of fellow CEOs and CFOs, and people will do introductions. So there's not really a formal process unless you wanted to hire a bank. You could also do that. But I would say that for these rounds of financing, it's not really necessary to have a bank, very different than an IPO.
So, we're a financial talk show, and it came up in our meeting prep with you that our show prep rather, bridge strategies. Can you talk a little bit about those that maybe you've used or you've seen used?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways to think about the way you want to finance companies or capture value. There's always the old tried and true in biotech, especially if you have a platform where maybe you'll license your first generation in order to have the capital to have the second generation. Of investors like that because it's non-dilutive, but you do have to be careful that you're not giving away the family jewels and kind of hamstringing yourself to operate as an independent company. So there's a little bit of a multiple considerations there. And then there's always creative deal structures that you can do. Big companies, big strategic companies are always looking for additional assets for their pipelines. And once you get these programs to a de-risk stage and you've made them proper investments, there's always a good time to engage strategic partners. And as you know, I've sold 4 previous biotech companies, all at different stages. And what usually happens in those situations is you run into value differences, right? The big guys want it for less, you're bored and you want it for more. And so the question is, how do you solve for that if you really want to do a strategic transaction? One tried and true approach that we've used, at least in 2 situations, is a contingent value right strategy. So it's called a CVR, where you agree to a future milestone. It helps the big company because they don't have to pay for something that may have a lot of risk. And they typically don't mind paying when it happens because it means that everything worked out really well, whether it's a sales milestone or a regulatory milestone or a clinical milestone. So that's kind of some of the things we've thought about. And I will say this, if you're the biotech company or you're the smaller guy, it really is incumbent upon you to come up with the creative solutions. Big companies have their models, they have their approaches. They typically don't want you meddling around once they've entered into an agreement, unless it's an early stage science agreement and they're tapping into you for your brain power. But we try to be creative when we engage, and we never say no. We just look for the next way to yes, so to speak. And maybe that's from our sales days.
It's smart.
Right. It does take a lot of work. And the other thing is, I would tell everyone, you just have to be patient. Yeah. And keep operating your companies and executing. And the better you do on execution and operation, the more opportunities for, creating value will occur.
So let's explore that. How do you think about creating value for your shareholders?
Yeah, it's great. Well, as I told you, Charlie, we always start with the patient in mind. Whenever I look at a biotech company, I say, is what we're going to invest multiple years and hundreds of millions of dollars, and is it worth it to the patients? And will it change their life? And if the answer is yes, well, then that's probably a pretty good project to initiate. And then when you think about, all right, well, how are we going to create value along the way? What we always like to say is we start with the end and we work backwards. So what we want to have a product that we're going to launch. It's going to be an injectable. It's going to be a global product. And then we do all the things backwards and we do it in staged gates. Because the other magic that happens in a venture capital startup biotech is you have to do stage appropriate spending. For example, we're going to be in phase 1-2. It would make no sense for me now to have a commercial team here. It would be a waste of capital. Now, when we get to phase 3, we certainly would want to have a commercial team that we'd be engaging. So you really have to think about what things are going to create value. And those things for an earlier stage biotech are things like regulatory approvals and your regulatory strategy and communications, your manufacturing processes, are they well defined and repeatable? And then also your IP. Do you actually own the product that you're developing? And so those are some of the things we think about in the early stages of building these companies.
Joe, I'm going to just go off script here for a second.
Okay.
What are the barriers of entry into your area of focus right now? When you thought about what you were going to do with this company, were there particular barriers that you were concerned about, and what are they, and how did you get past them?
Yeah, well, Kimon, we talked about it a little bit. The major barrier was when you're first and a new technology and no one has really seen it before, the real hurdle is, can you create the data package that will allow the regulators, who are basically like the neutral umpires, right? Their job is safety of people. They want to see new treatments brought forward, but their number one priority is safety. They don't want to do no harm. And so the barrier is, what was it going to take in order to convince regulatory authorities on a global basis to allow us to edit the genes of newborn babies? It sounds a little radical when we stand here and we talk about it. But the answer from our perspective, I want to give you some clarity here, is we picked the disease to go after. There were many that we could have chosen. We wanted to go after the worst, most devastating thing we could find, because we thought we could gain alignment with regulators to say, okay, the risk benefit is in alignment to allow this clinical trial. And then the thought was, over time, as we build a safety database, as we learn more about the approach, we produce cures that we could then pursue other indications that maybe aren't as devastating, but still significant. So that was probably the number one barrier here. And then, of course, capital, which is always a challenge. But when we started iECure, the world hadn't melted down. It was kind of after the Series A when the financial markets locked up. So that really became a secondary huge barrier, was capital.
Okay. What would success look like for iECure in the next 5 years?
Yeah, the success is we're going to bring iECure 506 to the market for these OTC babies. If the data from the first phase of the trial looks good, I would envision us engaging regulators about accelerated pathways for approval, so that we could get this product to these patients as soon as possible. And it's always a crowning achievement for any biotech or pharmaceutical company when a product gets approved. You hear about them, but people don't realize how many years, how much time, how much capital is required to actually execute and create a pharmaceutical product, or in this case, a gene editing product. And you don't really hear about the ones that fail, and there are many. So that's what we would consider success. And that's our sole mission.
I know you're a Philadelphia guy, so I want to give our focus a little bit to our community. What do you think are the biggest challenges for the greater Philadelphia area in terms of sustaining a vibrant life sciences community?
Yeah. Well, I would actually say we have a very vibrant life sciences community. I know we kind of always talk about this. We have great people here, great companies. I mean, I could list 10 right off the top of my head, and I know all the executives that are running them. Fantastic things that are being worked on. I think we have a secret weapon, right? Which I'm not a pen guy, but I work closely with them. What they're creating down there and the companies that are being potentially created and the labs down there are just terrific, world class. And so we have a real opportunity. We have the talent. We have the engines. I think Temple's now starting to look at creating some innovation, which would be exciting, and would hope others would be looking at that as well. So I think we have all the, and the other thing we have, Kimon, is we have a reasonable cost of living. You know, I was talking to someone the other day. I want to point this out. You can start, the C-suite can pretty much live anywhere, right? But it's not the C-suite that runs these companies. There's a lot of other folks, and not everyone can afford to live in Manhattan or even downtown Boston. Philadelphia is relatively an affordable place to live where you can raise a family, have a house, and probably commute to almost any part of our city. So I do want to throw a little plug out there for location and logistics. We have a great airport. I know people don't like the airport, but I actually like our airport. And we have the train. You're halfway. You can go down to see the FDA in Washington, and you can go up and kiss the rings in New York for the money. So it's a pretty good place. And I would put it up against any other location from that perspective. And I think we've really accelerated over the last 10 to 15 years.
We've got time for probably one more question, Kimon.
Okay, maybe a minute. Joe, what advice you have for folks who maybe have been displaced by life sciences or tech companies in the Philly area, who might be trying to decide whether or not they want to start a company around some technology with which they're familiar? What advice do you have for folks that might be thinking about that?
Yeah, I would say get a hold of the technology and work informally across the network. Reach out to people who are in venture or currently working in venture capital back companies, and see if what you're looking at is really viable, and then ask for introductions. Believe me, the finance people are not shy. They'll tell you whether you have something or not very quickly. So you can efficiently assess whether you have something of interest or not. But I would not, just because you hear the first no, though, I wouldn't just throw in the towel either. You got to be a little persistent. You might have to tweak your message. Maybe you have to do a little more work. But it's really, if you believe it and you have the commitment to it, then work the network. And nobody's smarter than everybody, and we have a lot of really smart people around here who can help you. And everybody's usually pretty helpful. People want to help, and so I would encourage that for sure.
Joe, you have been a great guest. Unfortunately, we've got to leave it here. Kimon, as always, thank you for co-hosting.
Thank you, Charlie.
I want to remind our viewers that Matt DeBera from the Contractors Consultants will be our next guest, and he will be discussing hiring in the construction industry on the next show. Wish everyone a good evening, and thank you for tuning in. See you next time.